Okay, so I'm trying this second chapter of The Butterfly Lion for the second time because the first recording seemed to fade away a bit. So here we go again. As you remember from yesterday, the little boy in the story had run away from the school where he was very unhappy and had been taken in and given tea by a very nice old lady who showed him out of the window a beautiful butterfly lion on the hillside made of blue butterflies all settling on some chalk. And then she started to tell him a story about Africa. And this is the story, and it's called Timbavati. Bertie was born in South Africa in a remote farmhouse near a place called Timbavati. It was shortly after Bertie first started to walk that his mother and father decided a fence must be put around the farmhouse to make a compound where Bertie could play in safety. It wouldn't keep the snakes out, nothing could do that, but at least Bertie would be safe now from the leopards and the lions and the spotted hyenas. Enclosed within the compound were the lawn and gardens at the front of the house and the stables and the barns at the back. All the room a child would need or want, you might think, but not Bertie. The farm stretched as far as the eye could see in all directions, 20,000 acres of veldt. Bertie's father farmed cattle, but times were hard. The rains had failed too often, and many of the rivers and waterholes had all but dried up. The fewer wildebeest and impala to prey on, the lions and leopards would sneak up on the cattle whenever they could. So Bertie's father was more often than not away from home with his men guarding the cattle. Every time he left, he'd say the same thing. "Don't you ever open that gate, Bertie, you hear me? There's lions out there, leopards, elephants, hyenas. You stay put, you hear?" Bertie would stand at the fence and watch him ride out, and then he would be left behind with his mother, who was also his teacher. There were no schools for 100 miles. And his mother, too, was always warning him to stay inside the fence. "Look what happened in Peter and the Wolf," she would say. His mother was often sick with malaria, and even when she wasn't sick, she'd be listless and sad. There were good days when she'd play the piano to him and play hide and seek around the compound, or he'd sit on her lap on the sofa out on the veranda, and she'd just talk and talk, all about her home in England and how much she hated the wilderness and loneliness of Africa, and about how Bertie was everything to her. But they were rare days. Every morning he'd climb into her bed and snuggle up to her, hoping against hope that today she'd be well and happy. But so often she wasn't, and Bertie would be left on his own again, to his own devices. There was a waterhole downhill from the farmhouse and some distance away. That waterhole, when there was water in it, became Bertie's whole world. He'd spend hours in the dusty compound, his hands gripping the fence, looking out at the wonders of the veldt, at the giraffes drinking spread-legged at the waterhole, at the browsing impala, tails twitching alert, at the warthogs snorting and snuffling under the shade of the shingai trees, at the baboons, the zebras, the wildebeest, and the elephants bathing in the mud. But the moment Bertie always longed for was when a pride of lions came padding out of the veldt. The zebra would panic and gallop off. Within seconds, the lions would have the waterhole to themselves, and they would crouch to drink. From the safe haven of the compound, Bertie looked and learned as he grew up. By now, he could climb the tree by the farmhouse and sit high in its branches. He could see better from up here. He'd wait for his lions for hours on end. He got to know the life at the waterhole so well that he could feel the lions were out there even before he saw them. Bertie had no friends to play with, but that was where he yearned to be. Whenever his mother was well enough, he would beg her to take him outside the compound, but her answer was always the same. "I can't, Bertie. Your father has forbidden it," she'd say, and that was that. The men would come home with their stories of the veldt, of the family of cheetahs sitting like sentinels on their kopje, of the leopard they'd spotted high in his tree larder, watching over his kill, of the hyenas they'd driven off, of the herd of elephants which had stampeded the cattle. And Bertie would listen wide-eyed, agog. Again and again, he asked his father if he could go with him to help guard the cattle. His father just laughed, patted his head, and said it was man's work. He did teach Bertie how to ride and how to shoot too, but always within the confines of the compound. Week in, week out, Bertie had to stay behind his fence. He made up his mind, though, that if no one would take him out into the veldt, then one day he'd go by himself. But something always held him back. Maybe it was one of those tales he'd been told of black mamba snakes whose bite could kill you within 10 minutes, of hyenas whose jaws would crunch you to bits, of vultures who would finish off anything that was left so that no one would ever even find the bits. For the time being, he stayed behind the fence. But the more he grew up, the more his compound became a prison to him. One evening, Bertie must have been about 6 by now, he was sitting high up in the branches of his tree, hoping against hope that the lions might come down for their sunset drink, as they often did. He was thinking of giving up, for it would soon be too dark to see much now, when he saw a solitary lioness come down to the waterhole. Then he saw that she was not alone. Behind her, and on unsteady legs, came what looked like a lion cub, but it was white, glowing white in the gathering gloom of the dusk. While the lioness drank, the cub played at catching her tail, and then when she had had her fill, the two of them slipped away into the long grass and were gone. Bertie ran inside, screaming with excitement. He had to tell someone, anyone. Found his father working at his desk. "Impossible," said his father. "You're seeing things that aren't there, or you're telling fibs, one of the two." "I saw him, I promise," Bertie insisted. But his father would have none of it and sent him to his room for arguing. His mother came to see him later. "Anyone can make a mistake, Bertie dear," she said. "It must have been the sunset. It plays tricks with your eyes sometimes. There's no such thing as a white lion." The next evening, Bertie watched again at the fence, but the white lion cub and the lioness did not come, nor did they the next evening, nor the next. Bertie began to think he must have dreamt it. A week or more passed, and there had only been a few zebras and wildebeest down at the waterhole. Bertie was already upstairs in his bed when he heard his father riding into the compound, and then the stamp of his heavy boots on the veranda. We got her," he was saying. "Huge lioness, massive she was. She'd taken 6 of our best cattle in the last 2 weeks, well, she won't be taking any more." Bertie's heart stopped. In that one terrible moment, he knew which lioness his father was talking about. There could be no doubt about it. His white lion cub had been orphaned. "But what if," Bertie's mother was saying, "what if she had young ones to feed? Perhaps they're starving." "So would we be if we let it go on. We had to shoot her," his father retorted. Bertie lay there all night, listening to the plaintive roaring echoing through the veldt, as if every lion in Africa was sounding a lament. He turned his face into his pillow and could think of nothing but the orphaned white cub, and he promised himself there and then that if ever the cub came to the waterhole looking for his dead mother, then he would do what he had never dared to do. He'd open the gate and go out and bring him home. He would not let him die out there all alone. But no lion cub came to his waterhole. All day, every day, he waited for him to come. But he never came. And that's the beginning of the story of Bertie and the White Lion. And tomorrow we'll read a bit more. Do you think he finds the White Lion? Maybe he does.